Hi everyone, I'm Jonah, 35, and I never thought I'd be the type of person posting here, but after today, I just need to get this off my chest. This isn't some dramatic over-the-top story. At least, I don't think it started that way, but by the end of the afternoon, it felt like I was in a completely different world, one where every single person I thought I knew was suddenly a villain. I grew up in a blended family. My dad remarried when I was 15, and his new wife, Claudia, had two kids. Lyle, who was only a year older than me, and Fiona, my stepsister. Lyle mostly stayed out of the drama, but Fiona, she was relentless. From the moment we met, she had this smug way of looking at me, like she was already tallying how little I'd amount to. Fast forward 25 years, and family BBQs at my dad and Claudia's place have always been a minefield. You have the cousins whispering about who got what inheritance, aunts subtly critiquing your career choices, and then Fiona, my stepsister, making those thinly veiled jokes about how I still can't hold down a real job. I should clarify something about my life, because apparently, it's the elephant everyone pretends isn't in the room. I run a small chain of custom furniture stores now, and it's been years of grinding. I've worked so hard, taking risks, reinvesting every cent I could. But the thing is, my family, they've always been the type to belittle effort unless they can see instant, flashy results. Slow, steady success? They can't see it. They just see someone struggling. Today was supposed to be just another barbecue. I arrived a little late because of deliveries, carrying nothing but a light jacket and my bag. Immediately, Fiona spotted me. She tilted her head, smirked, and said loud enough for the table to hear, "Oh, look who's here. Jonah, come tell us how many hours you spent trying to make your little shop work this week." There was a ripple of quiet laughter from some of my cousins. My dad tried to smile, but it was weak, the kind of smile that says, "I wish I could intervene, but I know it won't end well." Claudia didn't even bother. She just gave me that polite nod that really meant, "You're welcome here, but don't expect me to back you up." I sat down at the end of the table, letting Fiona and Lal have their little performance. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore the snickering. Usually, I'd leave these comments alone. I've learned over the years that arguing with Fiona is like swinging at air. She enjoys the sound of her own voice more than actually saying anything. The food was fine. The usual grilled chicken, potato salad, my dad's weak attempt at pulled pork. But the real entertainment started after lunch. My cousin Henry, who's 15 years younger than me, leaned over and whispered, "Do you ever think about just giving up? Fiona says you'll never make it on your own." I gave him a small smile. "I've made it this far, haven't I?" Henry shrugged, but didn't push further. He knows the tension is worse when he pokes at it. But I could feel the eyes of the rest of the cousins, the way they glanced at me, whispered behind hands. I'm not usually bothered by judgment. I'm used to it. But there's something about years of consistent underestimation that builds this itch, a need to prove something quietly. And then it happened, the moment that nobody saw coming. I was walking out to refill my water when Mr. Anders, the neighbor who just moved in a few weeks ago, called me over. Everyone assumed he was just some quiet, retired guy who liked to keep to himself. I waved politely, and he smiled, holding out a tablet. "Hey Jonah, sorry to bother you. I heard about your business from a friend downtown. Thought you might want to take a look at some of the numbers I compiled." I frowned, curious. "Numbers?" He swiped through the tablet, revealing revenue charts, profit margins, expansion plans, all neatly organized. I nodded, impressed. "These are impressive, but what's this for?" Before I could ask further, Fiona, Lyle, and some of the cousins wandered over, drawn by the murmuring. Fiona's eyes widened, and suddenly she was leaning in, trying to peek at the screen over Mr. Anders' shoulder. "What is that?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Mr. Anders turned the tablet slightly, showing detailed reports of my business performance, the steady growth, the sales figures, the projections for the next 3 years. I could literally see Fiona's smirk faltering, her eyes flicking from the screen to me. The cousins stopped whispering mid-conversation. Utensils clattered. Conversations froze. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time in years, I felt them see me. Not the struggling stepbrother Fiona had been mocking for decades. Not the guy who couldn't make it on his own, but the person who had quietly built something substantial from the ground up. Fiona's mouth opened, then closed, like she didn't know what to say. My dad's weak smile disappeared entirely, replaced by that awkward look of someone realizing he had underestimated his own son. Claudia stepped back, clearly uncomfortable, while my cousins just stared, some in awe, some in envy. I glanced at Mr. Anders, who raised an eyebrow at me, silently saying, "Go ahead. Let them see." And that's when Fiona's voice came out, a little too loud this time, sharp and defensive. "Well, that's not everything. You don't really own all of that, do you?" I smiled. Not a smug smile, but the kind that says, "Oh, you really have no idea what you're talking about." "Actually," I said slowly, letting every word land, "I do. Every bit of it." The room went quiet again, but now it wasn't just curiosity. There was tension. I could see her mind racing, the gears turning as she tried to figure out how to regain control, how to humiliate me in front of everyone. But for the first time, she couldn't. Fiona's face flushed, and for the first time, I noticed the way she looked genuinely unsettled. She quickly straightened, trying to regain her usual posture of superiority, but it was too late. The subtle control she had over the room had slipped, and everyone sensed it. Even Lyle, who usually stayed neutral, was glancing at her with a confused frown. "Jonah," Fiona began, her voice a little higher than usual, like she was trying too hard to assert herself. "You must have gotten help, right? Someone must be funding all this." I raised an eyebrow and shook my head. "No one is funding it. It's my own work. Everything you see is the result of years of planning, risk, and actual effort." She blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "But you can't do all of that alone," she said, now barely hiding the panic creeping into her voice. The cousins murmured among themselves, some still whispering, some staring with wide eyes. I noticed Henry shifting uncomfortably in his seat, unsure if he should be impressed or still siding with Fiona, who had been his favorite for as long as he could remember. My dad cleared his throat, finally stepping into the awkward silence. "Well, Jonah, that's quite an accomplishment," he said, his voice hesitant, the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to offend someone but also don't fully grasp the magnitude of what they're seeing. I mean, I'm proud of you." It came out weak, strained. Claudia didn't say a word. Instead, she gave a polite nod and quickly returned to stirring the potato salad, as if any acknowledgement of my success would somehow stain the atmosphere she preferred. Fiona, however, wasn't done. She leaned forward, trying again to mask the growing terror in her expression. You're exaggerating. These numbers, there must be some mistake. Maybe Mr. Anders misread something?" Mr. Anders looked over at her, and I saw a small smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. "No mistake," he said evenly. "These are accurate. I pulled the reports myself. Jonah's company has been outperforming local competitors for years, and his growth projections are conservative. He's on track to double revenue in the next 2 years." Fiona's hand shot to her mouth. I could see her brain working, trying to craft some way to save face, some way to turn the tables. But nothing came. The cousins were now openly staring, some whispering, some leaning in as if they'd been watching a magic trick. Lal finally spoke up, almost cautiously. "Jonah, that's impressive. I didn't know you were doing this well." The words themselves weren't harmful, but the weight behind them, the implication that he had spent years assuming I was a failure, stung more than Fiona's taunts. I gave him a small nod. "Thanks. I didn't make a big deal of it, but I've been running the stores for over a decade now." It was then that the real tension started to build. Fiona's eyes darted around the table, taking in faces of cousins who were no longer smirking, a dad who looked stunned, and an aunt who had been quietly observing from the corner, her expression unreadable. There was no mockery here anymore. Not yet. Only shock. She tried a new tactic. "Well, it's still just a small business. You're not, like, a millionaire or anything." I smiled inwardly. Small business? That's exactly what she thought. But the numbers Mr. Anders had pulled weren't small. They reflected a chain of stores across 3 cities, hundreds of employees, and profits that could rival some of the larger family ventures. I kept my smile neutral. You'd be surprised. The numbers speak for themselves. And that's when the subtle cruelty of my family started to show itself in full force. My Aunt Ruth, who had been quietly observing and sipping her tea, leaned over and said, her voice dripping with condescension, "Jonah, don't get too proud. You may have some success now, but anyone can have a lucky streak. What happens if something goes wrong? You don't have the stability that real families provide." I felt the blood rush to my face, not from anger, but from the realization that this was their default mode. No matter what I achieved, no matter how much I proved myself, they'd always see me as fragile, as someone undeserving. Fiona, sensing an ally in Ruth, tried again. Exactly. And what if you fail? You'll still be alone. You'll never make it on your own, Jonah. You'll see. I let the silence hang for a moment. Every eye at the table was now fixed on me. It was like a slow, deliberate pressure building in the room, designed to intimidate, to reduce me to the underdog they all assumed I was. And yet, for the first time, I realized something crucial. I wasn't the same Jonah they had tried to belittle for decades. I had built something tangible, something real, and they had underestimated not just my abilities, but my patience. I stepped closer to Fiona, keeping my voice calm but deliberate. You know, I said, letting the words settle, it's funny. I've heard that exact sentence my entire life. You'll never make it on your own. And yet, here we are. I'm standing in front of you, showing you exactly what you've been underestimating. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing, but there was nothing she could say. Every cousin was now watching, leaning forward like spectators in a theater, witnessing a quiet but unmistakable shift in power. And then it happened, the moment that would forever change the dynamic of every family gathering from now on. Henry, the cousin who had been on the sidelines, whispered something to Mr. Anders, who glanced at me and then looked up with that slight smirk again. Before I knew it, Mr. Anders tapped the tablet and swiped to another screen. Suddenly, the figures that had impressed them moments ago were now laid out in full detail. Projected profits, expansion plans, market shares, even comparative analysis showing my business outperforming a few of my relatives' family ventures. The room went dead silent. Forks clattered to the floor. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Fiona's mouth opened, then closed again, unable to form a coherent thought. My dad's eyes widened. Claudia's hand froze in mid-stir. Even the cousins who had whispered about my supposed failure were staring in disbelief. I could see the fear creeping into Fiona's expression, the realization that this wasn't just a small win. It was a complete exposure of everything she and the rest of the family had assumed about me. And just as I opened my mouth to say something, Fiona finally found her voice, sharp and defensive, but weak. This isn't fair. You shouldn't, this isn't. She trailed off, her confidence crumbling visibly. And that's when I knew this wasn't just a moment of personal triumph. It was the start of something much bigger. I had set the stage, and they were about to realize that for decades, they had underestimated someone they thought they could control, someone they thought they could dismiss. I took a deep breath, looking around at their shocked faces. And just as I was about to speak, my dad cleared his throat and said something that made my stomach tighten. Jonah, maybe we should talk after dinner. Privately. At that moment, I realized the subtle escalation had begun. Fiona's smirk was gone. Ruth's condescending smile was faltering. My dad was trying to regain control, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next few hours would be critical. Every move I made, every word I said, could either escalate this into a full-blown confrontation or allow them to regain their false sense of authority. The dinner plates had mostly cleared, but the air was still thick with tension. The casual chatter that usually filled my stepmother's backyard barbecue was gone. Instead, you could feel the weight of judgment, suspicion, and frustration pressing down from every direction. Fiona had moved to the far end of the table, pretending to sip water, her hands gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might crack. Ruth, my aunt, was shaking her head ever so slightly, muttering to herself about how things just can't go that smoothly. And my dad, well, my dad's weak smiles had been replaced by the kind of anxious pacing that only comes when someone realizes they might have been blind to the truth for decades. I stayed calm. Let them stew. I had spent years learning patience, learning to let people underestimate me. I knew that the more they tried to push me down, the easier it would be to let them fall into their own traps. Fiona finally made the first move. Jonah, she said, voice overly sweet now. Maybe you shouldn't flaunt these numbers like this. People might get the wrong idea. I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. Flaunt, I repeated slowly. I'm simply sharing the facts. I thought that's what family was supposed to celebrate, achievements, not mock them. Her eyes flicked to my dad, looking for backup. But my dad was silent. clearly realizing that this was no longer something he could control with a few mild words. Claudia, ever the observer, had finally moved closer to Fiona, as if to shield her, but her expression betrayed a hint of unease. Even Ruth looked a little unsettled, though she was trying to hide it behind her usual condescending posture. I let a small, deliberate pause stretch between us, long enough for the cousins to shift in their seats, whispering quietly, eyes darting between me and Fiona, watching the unraveling drama. "Do you want to know something funny?" I said finally, keeping my tone casual, almost conversational. "All of you spent years telling me I couldn't make it, that I'd never amount to anything without someone holding my hand, that I'd fail if I tried to go on my own. And yet, here I am, not only surviving, but thriving." Fiona's lip curled slightly, but it was more reflex than confidence. "It's just luck," she said quickly, trying to salvage her credibility. I leaned forward slightly, making sure my gaze swept over the entire table. "Luck," I repeated, voice calm but sharp. "Do you really think this is luck? This is 10 years of careful planning. Countless hours of research, late nights, negotiating every deal myself. Every failure taught me something. Every risk I took built something stronger. Luck doesn't make that happen. Strategy and effort do." Her face went pale. I could see the panic creeping in now, the realization that her usual tactic of belittling me wasn't going to work anymore. The cousins, sensing the shift, leaned in closer. Some of them were whispering, others just staring, wide-eyed. I took out my phone and casually tapped a few buttons, swiping through photos of my stores, screenshots of employee satisfaction surveys, emails from clients praising my service. I didn't have to say a word, just showing them was enough. They could see the tangible evidence. This wasn't some abstract concept they could dismiss. This was real, measurable, undeniable. And then I brought out the piece de resistance. "Mr. Anders helped me compile something you might find interesting," I said, and handed the tablet back to him. With a few swipes, he brought up a new section, a list of the family's own businesses, publicly available records, showing revenues, expenses, and annual growth rates. He highlighted a few of the relatives' ventures, the ones they always bragged about at gatherings. I watched as the room shifted. Eyes widened. Forks were forgotten. Fiona's smugness vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of fear. Ruth's condescending smile froze. My dad's brow furrowed deeply. Claudia shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the quiet, polite veneer of civility she tried to maintain was crumbling. I let the silence stretch. I let them feel the weight of their own assumptions, the years of dismissing me, mocking me, whispering behind hands. And then I spoke. "You see, I've been doing what you all never thought I could. And I've been doing it quietly, without drawing attention, without needing to prove myself to anyone but myself. Meanwhile, I've been keeping an eye on the things you brag about at every family gathering. And it's fascinating." I didn't need to finish the thought. The message was clear. I had been watching, learning, and now I was in a position to act. The subtle tremor in Fiona's hands told me she understood exactly what I meant. Ruth's pursed lips and shallow breath suggested the same. Even my dad, normally so adept at brushing things off, looked like he was realizing for the first time that he had misjudged his own child. Fiona's voice finally cracked, barely a whisper. "Jonah, you couldn't." I smiled faintly. "I could," I said simply. "And I have." It was then that I saw Henry's eyes flick to the tablet again, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. He knew, as well as I did, that the family's carefully maintained hierarchy, the one where certain people were supposed to be in control, where I was supposed to be insignificant, was no longer intact. I turned to Mr. Anders. "Would you mind showing them the projections for the next 5 years? The comparative growth analysis." With a few swipes, he brought up charts that placed my business head and shoulders above almost every other family venture in terms of profitability, sustainability, and market expansion. I didn't need to say anything. The visuals did the work for me. I glanced around the table. Fiona's face was almost white now, the panic obvious. Ruth had leaned back slightly, her lips pressed together as she tried to hide the shock. Claudia's hand hovered near her mouth. My dad looked like he'd been hit by a train. And the cousins? Well, the cousins were whispering frantically, trying to process what they were seeing. Fiona finally let out a strangled laugh, trying to regain composure. This doesn't mean anything. You'll hit a bump in the road. And then what? I leaned back in my chair, letting the words linger in the air, tasting the tension, savoring the shift in the room. Maybe, I said slowly. But unlike some people here, I have the resilience to recover. And I don't need anyone's approval to succeed. Her hands trembled slightly on the table now. I noticed my dad looking at Fiona, then at me, like he was trying to calculate how this had all slipped under his nose. Ruth cleared her throat, trying to reassert authority, but the usual power she wielded felt hollow. At that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. This was about showing them that their attempts to manipulate, belittle, and control me had consequences. And I had the upper hand, quietly, subtly, with no one realizing the full extent yet. Fiona leaned forward, voice sharp again, but faltering. Jonah, this isn't fair. You can't just. I raised a hand. I can, I interrupted calmly. And I have. For years, quietly. While you were all busy underestimating me, I've been building something real. Something tangible. And now, you're finally seeing it. Her eyes narrowed. Ruth's face hardened. My dad's jaw clenched. But the cousins were leaning in, curious, almost thrilled, some even whispering about what this meant for future gatherings. After that tense dinner moment, I excused myself under the pretense of checking on some business emails. Truth be told, I didn't need to. Everything I needed was already meticulously organized in the tablet Mr. Anders had prepared. But stepping away gave me the space to plan the next subtle move, and I knew timing would be everything. My family thrived on appearances. They loved to think they were in control. That arrogance, it was their weakness. By the time I returned to the backyard, the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Fiona was seated stiffly, picking at the remaining salad with a precision that betrayed her nerves. Ruth was muttering quietly to herself, glancing up every few seconds to watch me. Even my dad was pacing lightly near the grill, avoiding eye contact but clearly processing the confrontation. Claudia was hovering near the edge, trying not to be noticed but visibly uncomfortable. I walked up casually, carrying nothing but a water bottle, letting the ease in my demeanor contrast with the tension in the air. I could see Fiona's eyes flick to me again, calculating, desperate to reassert dominance. But she was too rattled, too exposed. Jonah, she said, voice forced polite now. Maybe you could explain how you managed to keep it all running? I mean, it must be complicated. Her attempt to mask jealousy as curiosity was transparent, and I smiled faintly. It is, I said, letting the word hang. But that's the point. Every detail is planned, tracked, and executed carefully. Every employee knows their role. Every branch follows the same systems. Consistency is the secret, something I've learned over the years while some people were busy underestimating me. She froze. The words weren't cruel, just a subtle mirror of her own years of condescension. Ruth's jaw tightened at the remark, and I noticed my dad shift uncomfortably, realizing that the invisible power he thought he held over me was slipping. Then I began the first move in my quiet revenge. By the way, I said casually, I noticed that some of the family's other ventures could use a bit of optimization. I did a little research, purely out of curiosity. Thought it might be interesting to share. Fiona's eyes narrowed instantly. Optimization? What are you talking about? I smiled, keeping the tone light, almost conversational, but the effect was devastating. Just some insights. I noticed that certain operations have unusually high overheads and questionable expense management. Simple changes could significantly improve profitability. I thought it might be helpful, purely as friendly advice. Ruth blinked, and I could see her calculating. Friendly advice from me? From someone she had spent decades dismissing? She didn't know whether to laugh or panic. The cousins whispered among themselves, sensing a new layer of tension. Then I reached for the tablet Mr. Anders had set up. With a few swipes, I pulled up anonymized comparative data of their businesses. Nothing defamatory, nothing illegal, just stark numbers showing how inefficient some family ventures had become compared to mine. The reactions were immediate. Fiona's mouth dropped slightly. Ruth's condescending mask slipped as she realized I had access to detailed financial information she hadn't expected anyone outside the family to see. My dad's brow furrowed deeply. Claudia's hand flew to her chest, subtly, as if she were bracing for what would happen next. I thought it was interesting, I continued, keeping the tone casual, how minor adjustments could lead to major gains. almost like teaching old dogs new tricks. Fiona's hand trembled on the table now. Jonah, you shouldn't. I cut her off gently. I'm simply sharing what I've learned. Knowledge isn't a weapon, unless someone chooses to misuse it. Her glare sharpened, but there was no attack left in her. She knew, deep down, that every insult she had thrown at me over the years had been recorded, measured, and now used against the assumptions she had built about me. Every sneer, every whispered comment had been quietly cataloged in my mind as motivation. And that's when I leaned in slightly, letting my voice drop just enough to carry over the quiet backyard. You know, it's funny. I remember countless family gatherings where I was mocked for taking risks, for trying to start something of my own. I remember every "you'll never make it," every whispered joke, every glance. And now, after years of patient work, I have something that even the sharpest criticism can't touch. Ruth's eyes flicked to my dad. I could see her silently calculating how much control they still had. Fiona's lip trembled. Claudia shifted her weight uncomfortably, realizing that the veneer of civility she maintained couldn't contain this anymore. Then I introduced the next subtle layer of revenge. You know, I said, there's been a lot of talk about inheritance and family legacy over the years. Funny how some people act like they have a guaranteed seat at the top. I've been curious, who really has a sustainable future if they don't adapt? The whispers started immediately. Henry nudged another cousin, gesturing subtly toward the tablet. I let them look, let them absorb the information. Every number, every chart, every projection was a quiet, undeniable reminder that assumptions could be wrong and arrogance could be fatal. Fiona, seeing the tide of attention shift away from her, tried one last feeble attack. Jonah, this isn't fair. You shouldn't. I smiled softly, almost sympathetically. Fair? That's subjective. What's important is who prepared, who learned, who actually did the work. And if that feels unfair to some, well, that's a consequence of underestimation. I let the words sink in. Every face at the table showed it. The cracks in their assumed superiority were widening. Fiona's panic was growing more obvious by the second. Ruth's carefully maintained authority was wavering. My dad's attempts at polite intervention were failing. Even the cousins were beginning to realize that the person they had written off as a struggling stepbrother had quietly built something far beyond their comprehension. And then, the final touch of my subtle revenge for the evening. I mentioned, almost in passing, that I'd be considering expansion into areas where some of their family businesses already operated. It's always interesting to see how markets respond to new competition, I said casually. I'd hate to unintentionally step on anyone's toes, but I believe in healthy growth and taking opportunities as they come. Fiona's face went pale. Ruth's hand trembled slightly. The cousins leaned forward, whispering frantically. Even my dad's jaw tightened. They all understood the implication. My friendly advice was not so friendly after all. My next moves were no longer hypothetical. I had put them on notice, subtly, quietly, and effectively. For the first time in years, the table felt smaller, constricting, like I had shifted the entire balance of power without raising my voice or causing a scene. And as I leaned back, calmly sipping my water, I realized that today wasn't just a victory. It was the opening move. Fiona's eyes met mine, a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. She tried to speak, to regain control, but the words faltered, and she sat back, trapped in the realization that the underdog she had spent decades mocking was no longer under anyone's control but his own. And that's when I knew. The subtle, slow, inescapable revenge had begun. I wasn't just proving a point anymore. I was rewriting the rules of the game entirely. Every assumption they had made about me, every slight, every whispered insult, would now be leveraged in ways they hadn't even imagined. The evening stretched on, awkward, tense, and silent in parts, with my family visibly trying to regain composure while knowing, deep down, they had lost their upper hand. The days after the barbecue were interesting, to say the least. I made it a point to maintain a low profile, quietly letting the events of that afternoon settle in their minds. Fiona had retreated to her usual posturing, trying desperately to regain some semblance of control, but her usual attacks were weaker now, forced. Every time she attempted to undermine me, I had already anticipated it, prepared evidence, or simply let her words hang in the air until their absurdity was clear to everyone. I began the next phase quietly. While they assumed I was focused on my stores, I was observing them. Fiona's small consulting business, which she had always boasted about, had a few cracks I had noted years ago. Ruth's attempts at expanding her boutique ventures were sloppy, relying on high-cost suppliers and poorly structured management. My dad, for all his talk of experience, had become a manager of appearances rather than results, often brushing over errors to maintain a polite image. I started leveraging the information I had quietly gathered. A friendly call to a few mutual business contacts, some subtle mentions in community networking events, and suddenly, Fiona's little consulting venture began losing contracts. I didn't advertise her failures or humiliate her publicly. I simply acted strategically, showing other clients that her services were inconsistent and overpriced, proof I had carefully compiled. Within months, she was scrambling, her confidence shredded, and her usual smugness replaced with frustration and desperation. Ruth, too, felt the effects, though in a different way. I quietly pointed out opportunities in areas she thought were hers exclusively. My expansions, calculated and conservative, started encroaching on her customer base. Nothing overt, just smart positioning and efficient marketing. By the end of the first year, several of her ventures were barely breaking even, while mine were thriving beyond projections. She had spent decades thinking herself untouchable, and I had quietly dismantled that belief. Fiona's eventual confrontation was almost laughable. She tried the old tactics: manipulation, guilt, and insinuations. "Jonah, we're family. You shouldn't be taking advantage," she said one day in a strained phone call. I listened patiently, and when she paused, I replied softly, deliberately. "Taking advantage? No. I'm using the same tools you and everyone else in this family have been using for years: judgment, assumptions, and underestimation. The difference is, I know how to plan for years, while you've been relying on appearances." Her silence was satisfying. She had no comeback. Everything she had assumed about me, that I was weak, naive, or dependent, had been systematically disproven. My dad tried to intervene once, nervously attempting to lecture me about family unity and consideration. I smiled politely, letting him finish. When he was done, I calmly explained, "Dad, I've been building my future quietly for years. No one doubted you or Ruth or Fiona more than I did. The difference is, I actually acted. I didn't just assume everything would come to me because I was family. That's the difference between you and me." He realized immediately he had no argument. Not one. I wasn't asking for approval. I was showing results. Claudia eventually stopped defending Fiona and Ruth. She remained polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with how the family dynamic had shifted. The subtle hierarchy they had maintained for decades, the one where they dictated who succeeded and who failed, was gone, completely dismantled. By the second year, my expansion plans had grown further. Stores opened in cities where my relatives had long assumed their dominance. Contracts, partnerships, and deals fell into my hands effortlessly, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because I had prepared thoroughly, capitalized on my strengths, and quietly exposed their weaknesses through strategy rather than confrontation. Fiona's business dissolved quietly after a series of failed contracts. She had no one to blame but herself. Ruth's boutiques, now struggling to stay afloat, were forced to downsize. My dad, realizing his lack of foresight and understanding, kept a low profile, unable to criticize or interfere. My cousins, who once whispered and smirked at me, now consulted me in private, some even apologizing for underestimating my work ethic, though their apologies were thin and clearly motivated by necessity rather than genuine contrition. The ultimate, satisfying moment came at the next family barbecue, 2 years later. Fiona tried her usual smirk, but it faltered immediately when she saw me walking up, confident, calm, successful. The cousins whispered quietly, eyes flicking to my newest expansion reports displayed casually on my tablet, knowing exactly how much ground I had gained. "Jonah," Fiona started, but I cut her off gently. "Yes, Fiona?" I asked, voice calm, almost serene. "Do you want to discuss what it takes to build something real? Or shall we talk about what it takes to watch assumptions crumble quietly over time?" Her face went pale. Ruth leaned back, eyes narrowing, while my dad shuffled uncomfortably. The air was thick with realization. They had spent decades trying to control, belittle, and underestimate me. And now, quietly but deliberately, I had shown them exactly who they were dealing with. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw insults. I simply let the evidence, the success, and the calm confidence speak for itself. And it did. Every attempt at mockery, every whispered slight, had been neutralized. Every assumption they had made about me had been used against them, strategically, carefully, and completely. By the end of the afternoon, Fiona was nowhere near her usual dominant self. Ruth had retreated into quiet reflection, clearly plotting how to recover from the damage I had caused. My dad, finally acknowledging his misjudgment, stayed silent. And the cousins? They were still processing. Some whispered to each other, realizing that the underdog they had dismissed had quietly rewritten the rules. I walked away that evening with a sense of satisfaction I had never felt before. Not revenge for its own sake, not vindictiveness, but quiet justice. They had spent decades as the villains in my life, belittling, dismissing, undermining, and now the power balance had shifted. I had won not by force, not by confrontation, but by patience, strategy, and competence. And in the quiet moments afterward, I realized the most important thing. They would never underestimate me again. They would never assume weakness where there was none. They would never feel in control again. I had turned every insult, every manipulation, and every attempt at control into a stepping stone for my success. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all. Fiona's consulting business is gone. Ruth's ventures are struggling to recover. My dad remains silent and cautious, no longer confident in his assumptions. Claudia maintains polite distance. The cousins, once arrogant and dismissive, now treat me with cautious respect, some even seeking advice. I've expanded my business quietly but decisively, taking control of markets once dominated by the family. My reputation for strategic acumen has grown, and the family's arrogance and entitlement have been systematically dismantled. No apologies were offered or accepted. No forgiveness was given. They remain villains, trapped in the consequences of underestimating someone they spent decades mocking. And I am finally free, successful, and fully in control of my own destiny. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.